Someone loves you more deeply than you might realize, and they are fully aware of your age. But there is a detail here that changes everything, a twist hidden beneath what seems simple on the surface. Before you continue, slow down for a moment. Not because something is wrong, but because what you are about to understand might reach into places you thought were long settled inside you. There is someone out there who knows your age, not vaguely, not as an assumption. They are aware of the number, the years you have lived, and everything those years quietly carry with them. They understand the timeline of your life more than most people ever bother to. The phases you went through, the chapters you survived, the moments you outgrew without even realizing you were outgrowing them, the delays, the detours, the rebuilding phases that never make it into casual conversation. And still, their feelings remain. This is not surface-level attraction. It is not about convenience. It is not about filling emotional emptiness or passing time. And it is definitely not about loneliness disguised as connection. What they feel is something more observant, more intentional, and far less impulsive than what people usually assume when they hear the word love. But here is where the unexpected part begins. Because while part of you may assume that knowing your age would create distance, hesitation, or comparison, in their mind, it does something completely different. It removes illusion. They don't see your age as a limitation. They don't attach it to expectations the way society often does. They don't map your value against timelines, milestones, or what should have happened by now. Instead, they interpret your age as context, and within that context, they see something most people overlook entirely. They see depth. They notice how you don't rush into emotional spaces the way you might have in the past, how you pause before you trust, how you observe people carefully instead of giving yourself away too quickly. Not because you are closed off, but because you have learned the cost of giving too much too soon. They see the way you listen differently now, not just to words, but to intention, to silence, to what is being avoided as much as what is being said directly. They recognize that your emotional reactions are no longer impulsive in the way they might have been years ago. There is restraint there. There is awareness. There is a kind of internal stability that was not built overnight. And perhaps most importantly, they see how you've survived things that didn't just pass through your life, but shaped it. Moments that would have caused some people to shut down completely instead became something you adapted to. Not perfectly, not easily, but in a way that left you more aware, more cautious, and in some ways, more grounded. That is what they are responding to. Not an idea of who you were, not a fantasy of who you might become, but who you are right now, with everything you carry and everything you have learned to hold quietly. To them, your age is not a signal of decline or limitation. It is evidence of experience. It is proof that you have lived through enough to understand what superficial connection feels like, and you no longer confuse it with something real. And that changes how they see you, because there is something undeniably attractive about emotional maturity. Not in a performative sense, not in a polished or rehearsed way, but in the quiet presence of someone who no longer needs to prove their worth in loud ways. Someone who doesn't chase validation the same way they once might have. Someone who has learned that intensity is not the same as intimacy. Someone who has started valuing peace over chaos, even if part of them still remembers what chaos felt like. But here is the twist that creates confusion. This person is not only drawn to you, they are also aware of what it would require to come closer to you. They can sense that you are not easily accessible emotionally anymore. Not because you are distant, but because you are selective. You don't open doors quickly. And once you recognize emotional inconsistency, you don't ignore it the way you used to. So their feelings exist in a strange space. They admire you deeply, but they also hesitate. They feel pulled in, but also held back by their own awareness of what connection with you actually demands. This is often where mixed signals begin to appear. One moment, there is clarity in their attention. The next, there is distance. Not because their feelings disappear, but because they are trying to understand their own readiness. And if that feels confusing, it's because it is not a simple emotional story. It is a tension between attraction and self-awareness, between desire and hesitation, between what they feel and what they are capable of sustaining consistently. Meanwhile, you are not who you used to be in these dynamics either. You are no longer responding purely from hope. You are observing patterns. You are noticing repetition. You are paying attention to what is consistent and what only appears in moments. And somewhere inside you, a quiet shift is happening. You are beginning to understand that being understood is not enough if it doesn't come with stability. That being seen is not meaningful if it doesn't translate into presence. That emotional depth alone cannot replace consistency. So even as this connection feels significant, part of you is no longer willing to ignore imbalance just because something feels intense or meaningful in moments. And that is where everything becomes clearer. Because real connection is not defined by how deeply someone feels in isolated moments. It is defined by what remains steady over time, what survives distance, what continues without confusion becoming the default state. This person may truly see you. They may genuinely admire what you have become. They may even feel something they cannot easily explain. But what matters next is not potential. It is behavior. It is consistency. It is whether what they feel can actually translate into something that does not leave you guessing where you stand, because you are no longer in a place where emotional ambiguity feels like something you need to decode endlessly. And deep down, they sense that too, which is why this connection feels powerful, but also unresolved. Not because it lacks meaning, but because meaning alone is never enough to build something stable. You don't love loudly anymore. You love with depth. You don't chase attention the way you might have once done. You don't need to be constantly seen, constantly validated, or constantly reassured to feel that something is real. Instead, you bring presence, steady, grounded, intentional presence, the kind that doesn't fluctuate based on emotional highs or external reactions. You don't pursue people anymore. You choose them. And that shift didn't happen overnight. It was not a sudden realization or a single moment of clarity. It came with time, with experience, with emotional cycles that repeated just enough to teach you what drains you and what sustains you, what stays consistent and what only feels meaningful in the beginning because of intensity rather than depth. Your age, in that sense, is not just a number. It represents emotional maturity that was earned, not assumed. It has become a form of discipline, a quiet understanding of what you will no longer tolerate, what you will no longer entertain, and what you no longer need to explain twice in order for it to be understood. You don't engage in emotional games anymore. You don't manipulate situations just to feel secure. You don't test people to confirm their loyalty or create confusion in order to force clarity. You've outgrown the need to destabilize connection just to understand it. And because of that, something subtle but powerful begins to happen around you. For someone who has been emotionally exhausted by inconsistency and shallow connection patterns, you don't feel overwhelming or chaotic. You feel like stability, not excitement that burns quickly, but calmness that lasts longer than the moment. And that is exactly why they are drawn to you, even when they can't fully articulate it to themselves, because your presence does not demand performance. It does not require emotional exaggeration. It does not force someone to become something they are not in order to be accepted. It simply asks for honesty. But there is another layer here that you may not immediately see. They are not afraid of you, and they are not afraid of love itself. What they are afraid of is what happens after feelings become real enough to require direction. Because once genuine emotion enters the picture, the mind does not remain passive for long. It begins to calculate. It begins to project. It begins to simulate outcomes that have not yet happened but suddenly feel possible. What if this becomes too serious too quickly? What if I fall deeper than I intended? What if external circumstances don't align with what I am feeling? What if timing becomes the barrier that emotion cannot solve? And instead of expressing these fears directly, most people do something far more subtle. They hesitate. Not always in obvious ways, not always in ways that are immediately readable, but in small emotional adjustments, slight delays in communication, temporary withdrawal, a shift in tone that does not fully explain itself. a presence that becomes less consistent even though interest has not necessarily disappeared. But here is the part that is almost always misunderstood. That distance is not always the absence of feeling. In many cases, it is the result of feeling too much at once without having a clear internal structure for what to do with it. Because when someone starts to care deeply, they do not always move forward faster. Sometimes they slow down, they overthink, they begin to evaluate consequences before action. They try to protect the outcome from becoming something they might not be able to handle emotionally. This is where the hidden contradiction exists. When someone genuinely values you, they don't always become more expressive in a linear way. They become more careful, more observant, more aware of how easily something meaningful can become unstable if handled without clarity. Because in their mind, this is no longer a casual interaction. It is something that carries emotional consequence. And that realization creates pressure. Not pressure from you, not pressure you have imposed, but pressure created internally by the weight of what the connection represents in their own perception. They begin to understand something important about you, that you are not someone who thrives in inconsistency. You are not someone who can be emotionally available only in fragments. You are not someone who can remain in uncertainty indefinitely without eventually withdrawing your emotional investment. You are not a temporary emotional experience that can be revisited whenever convenient. You are someone who requires clarity, stability, honesty, consistency, and a level of emotional responsibility that cannot be performed occasionally. It has to be sustained. And deep down, they know that. Which is exactly why hesitation begins to appear. Not because they question your value, but because they begin questioning their own readiness. Am I capable of showing up consistently? Can I maintain emotional responsibility in something that actually matters? Am I prepared for the level of clarity this connection would require from me? So, while from the outside, this dynamic may appear confusing, mixed signals, moments of closeness followed by distance, silence that interrupts momentum, and returns that feel unstructured, the internal reality is far more layered. There is care, but also caution, attraction, but also self-doubt, desire, but also awareness of personal limitations, interest, but also fear of misalignment between emotional intensity and practical stability. And you are no longer the version of yourself who ignores these patterns just because emotion is present. You notice them. You feel when energy changes without explanation. You recognize when consistency is missing. You understand when presence becomes unpredictable instead of reliable. And something within you has already begun to evolve because of that awareness. You are no longer confusing emotional intensity with emotional safety. You are no longer labeling uncertainty as connection simply because feelings exist. You are no longer willing to interpret inconsistency as potential without evidence of direction. And that is where clarity begins to form, not as an emotion, but as an understanding. Because real connection is not measured by how strongly it is felt in moments of closeness alone. It is measured by what remains steady when emotion is not at its peak. What continues without confusion becoming the dominant language. What survives beyond intensity and enters structure. This person may genuinely care. They may feel something real. They may even be uncertain because they recognize the significance of what they are feeling. But feelings alone are no longer the deciding factor. What matters now is whether those feelings can translate into consistency. Because you are no longer available for emotional uncertainty that never resolves into action. And on some level, they already sense that about you too, which is why the connection feels strong but unfinished. Not because it lacks emotion, but because emotion without stability cannot determine its own future. They check on you in ways you don't always notice. Not directly, not in obvious, easy-to-spot ways, but in quiet, subtle patterns through indirect updates, small observations, and the kind of awareness that only comes when someone is genuinely paying attention over time rather than briefly engaging and forgetting. They notice things others overlook. Small changes in your tone, the way your energy shifts in different conversations, the way you respond differently depending on how you feel about someone or something. Even silence is not invisible to them. It becomes a kind of language they try to interpret rather than ignore. And without making it visible or dramatic, they protect your dignity in conversations. They don't expose you. They don't reduce you to something simple or convenient for humor. They don't speak carelessly about you when you're not present, even in moments where it would be easy to do so or socially acceptable to make light of it. Even in situations where humor could naturally slip into disrespect, especially around sensitive details like age, timing, or personal history, they hold back, not because they are forced to, but because something in them registers that you are not someone to be casually framed or lightly dismissed. And yet, despite all of that subtle care, they still hesitate to fully step forward, because something deeper is happening internally that you cannot see from the outside. Their emotions are already involved, but their thoughts are still trying to organize what that involvement actually means in practical terms. It is not confusion in the sense of not feeling anything. It is more like recognition without full commitment to interpretation. Feeling something is one thing. Knowing what to do with it is another. They are not just reacting anymore, they are imagining. And that shift changes the entire structure of how they relate to you. Because now, they don't just experience you as a passing presence or a temporary connection that exists only in the current moment. They begin to project continuity into it. Their mind starts forming extended versions of interaction, longer conversations that don't feel rushed, silences that don't feel awkward or filled with pressure, emotional exchanges that don't require constant explanation or justification just to exist. A kind of connection starts forming in their imagination where presence feels steady rather than unpredictable, where nothing has to be constantly proven in order to remain valid, where emotional space doesn't collapse every time there is distance. And this is where things become more complex internally for them, because your age, your lived experience, and the sense of emotional maturity they perceive in you begin to add another layer of meaning to what they are feeling. It is not simply a detail, it becomes a signal, rightly or wrongly interpreted, that you are not in a phase of uncertainty about identity, direction, or emotional intent. You appear to them as someone who has already gone through enough of life to understand what aligns with you and what does not, what you tolerate and what you won't, what feels real and what feels empty. And that perception makes the idea of getting close feel more serious in their mind. Not lighter, not casual, not flexible in the way superficial or short-lived connections often are. Instead, it starts to carry weight, a sense of consequence, a sense that if this develops, it would not be something shallow that can be entered and exited without emotional impact, and that seriousness creates hesitation. Because when someone starts to feel that a connection is not just momentary in their mind, they stop treating it casually, even if they haven't said anything out loud about it. The awareness itself is enough to change their behavior, so they begin to move differently. They become more careful, more observant, less impulsive. They don't rush to define anything, but they also don't fully detach. They remain in a middle space where awareness is high, but expression is controlled. What you need to understand in a moment like this is important, especially because this kind of dynamic can easily be misread when you are inside it. Do not reduce yourself in response to hesitation. Do not turn uncertainty into self-doubt or assume that distance automatically means disinterest. And do not assume that what you are sensing is instability in the connection itself, because not every pause is a sign of absence. Sometimes it is the result of someone trying to measure significance without distorting it. There is a difference between emotional withdrawal and emotional processing. One ignores the connection entirely, the other stays aware of it, but moves slowly because it does not want to misstep. And those two things can feel similar from the inside if you are only looking at surface behavior, because if this person truly did not care, their behavior would look very different. It would be inconsistent without awareness, fast without consideration, present in bursts, then gone without reflection. Attention would come and go without depth, and emotional engagement would feel self-centered rather than observant. There would be no lingering thoughtfulness in how they interact with you when they are not directly speaking to you. But that is not the pattern being described here. Instead, what exists is a kind of continued awareness, a presence that does not fully disappear even in distance, a respect that remains intact even when communication is not active, a level of attentiveness that suggests they are still mentally accounting for you even when they are not actively engaged. And that creates a very different emotional situation to interpret, because now the absence is not empty. It is structured, it has weight. It has awareness inside it. And inside that structure, something is happening that is not always visible externally. They are trying to understand what it means to feel this and what it requires from them, not just emotionally, but practically, in timing, in expression, in responsibility, in what it would mean if they allowed it to develop instead of keeping it contained at the level of thought and subtle behavior. The final truth in moments like this is often less dramatic than people expect. It is not always about someone running toward you or running away from you. Sometimes it is simply about someone standing at the edge of emotional recognition, trying to decide how to move without turning something meaningful into something unstable through carelessness or misunderstanding. They are still there, not fully in, not fully out, but aware enough to not treat it lightly anymore. And that awareness itself is what changes the entire dynamic. Because what begins as subtle attention eventually becomes something they have to mentally account for, even in silence, and whether or not it is spoken yet. That is the point where a connection stops being just a passing experience in their mind and starts becoming something they have to understand before they can safely define it.